welcome to the Limitless podcast stage. I'm up here with Ken McElroy and Jan Jekielek, and he is the senior editor at the Epoch Times. He's also the author of Killed to Order, which we are going to get into in a bit. So welcome, Jan.
It's so good to be here with you guys.
Yeah, thanks for flying all the way out here, too.
Yeah.
By the way, we love the Epoch Times. We've done a lot of stuff with them, and they're such a leading organization for news.
Well, and you guys, really help people, build their income, right? And that's also very important to us for our subscribers. So
Yeah, so let's you want to start off talking about the book?
Well, no, actually, I don't want to start off talking about the book, Ken.
Okay.
But what I do want to start off talking about is China, because we're all, China is becoming a bigger and bigger part of our market, and we don't really understand the Chinese Communist Party. And that is what Jan has really dug into, throughout his book and just in general throughout his career. So let's just start with this question. Jan, what do you think fundamentally that Americans don't understand about the CCP?
wow, there's a great many things, but Deng Xiaoping, back in the day, he became the dictator, the paramount leader of China, and he realized that they were going to collapse economically, right? So this new maxim got pushed out into society: to be rich is glorious, to be glorious. Okay, so now it said, look, and by the way, Chinese, this is a stereotype, but it's really true. I work with a lot of Chinese, unbelievably entrepreneurial, so basically it said, you know what, this whole private property thing, we got rid of it. Well, actually, it's okay in a small scale, as long as you don't go against the party, to do well for yourself, to start making money, to build a business, and we're not going to take it from you. Because think about the incentive structures, right? Before, you want to build a business, but the moment you have anything of value, someone comes and takes it with the barrel of a gun, as Mao famously said, right? But now it's saying, no, you get to keep what you build. People were thrilled, so that you see this huge kind of surge in growth, right? However, the deal was like this: don't touch politics. Don't touch anything the Chinese Communist Party is interested in. If you get big enough, accept the communist cadre who's really in charge, who really has the bottom line to say what happens in that company, right? But, and that actually saved China, that regime, from collapse, because they economically, the the labor theory of value was discredited, like 150 years ago, right? So there's no reasonable economic theory for communism. If the regime doesn't have a priority of something, it doesn't care. Like, for example, if you have a stand on the street and you're selling some kind of great food that people love, so you get these big lineups coming and everything, probably you're okay, as long as there isn't like a leader, someone in the regime, in the local government, that says, hey, I want to control that. Because the moment that interest of the regime, whatever scale, national, local, in between, whenever that interest comes in, now you're no longer your own person. And of course, all the time you have to grease the right palms to make sure that cart doesn't get taken away, that your permit suddenly, oh, you don't have a permit, sir, right? Yeah. So the answer is, you can be entrepreneurial, but it's highly conditional.
Well, I know several entrepreneurs from the U.S. that have gone to China and started a business, or maybe they were making part of their business, and then all of a sudden the piracy, they end up just knocking them off, creating a whole, I've even heard they've even had a whole Apple store completely looking like an Apple store. And I can't, this is back when Steve Jobs was still around. He went over there. He's like, we don't have an Apple store in China, but there was one, and every single product was knocked off. And so, it's interesting. We haven't been able to kind of penetrate that market at all.
Well, Ken, hold on. Aren't all of your books written in Chinese as well?
They are. Well, yeah, we don't have a Chinese publisher, but my books are all in Chinese.
Well, but here's the thing, because Chinese, this is the crazy thing, right? Like, Chinese are unbelievably entrepreneurial people. It's a cultural feature. As much as the Communist Party tried to rip out the tradition out of that Chinese culture, they could not rip out the entrepreneurship sort of impulse from the Chinese. And let me talk about this Apple store for a moment. This is a huge problem for Apple, right? This Apple store. Why? Because there's very high level officials that were involved in that Apple store. See, So what are you going to do? You're saying, hey, hey guys, you have all these fake products and are you using our logo? And that's crazy. So what do you do? Well, you can actually do nothing because one, the magistrate works on behalf of the regime and plays poker with those high level officials, right? So you can't, there's no rule of law actually, right? So you don't really have recourse. Or what you have to do is you have to kind of make a deal, pay off the right people, and maybe this thing will go away. But it's not like this. There's no kind of you don't have a right to your IP there all of a sudden saying, hey, this is unfair, this is unreasonable, right? And what's going to happen? Let's say you did take a stand and you did make a big fuss, right? What's going to happen? Well, hey, wait a second, that Apple production factory over there. Hey, it looks like there's some kind of problem with your robots there. They don't have the right paperwork. Got to shut you down for a while. You sure? You're still sure you want to talk about this Apple store? And you're like, nah, we love the Apple store.
Yeah.
It's awesome, right?
So you brought up China's 2017 National Intelligence Law. So this was new in the last few years, so probably the last 10 years, but what does it require?
And now a word from my paid sponsor, PadSplit. Look, if you've been trying to make single-family rentals pencil out in this market, you already know that the math can be tight. With high rates, properties that would have cash flowed 5 years ago now often break even at best. So what do? You wait on the sidelines and miss out, or maybe you find a better model? That's why I want to talk about today's sponsor, PadSplit. Here's an example of the math in some markets. A 4-bedroom renting for $2,700 as a traditional rental may be able to gross over $6,000 a month in a co-living setup through PadSplit, depending on location, occupancy, and costs. The same house can potentially more than double the gross revenue in the right market. And before you think, that sounds like a headache, PadSplit helps with member screening and rent collection while still allowing you to operate the property and make management decisions. This is one strategy investors use to try to make deals work when traditional rentals don't pencil. If you want to see the numbers for yourself, go to padsplit.com/hosts. I'll have a link in the description. Just run the math on the property you already own and see if it's a fit. You might be surprised.
If you're an American in China, you're also required to cooperate with Chinese state security and also not allowed to disclose that you've done so according to their law. Obviously puts Americans in a very weird situation, right?
Well, I know you and I were talking before you came about the gold mine that Robert Kiyosaki, you guys might know that Robert way back talks about this gold mine that he went over and did in China, right? And spent a bunch of money and they discovered gold and then they took it.
Right? You know how meticulous Robert Kiyosaki is, right? He did everything right. He got the rights, everything's going, and suddenly, oh, sorry, this isn't yours. This happened to Fellows, okay? You remember the shredder company? You guys have shredders. Fellows Shredders, big American brand, right? They built a company in China, I think $100 million factory, and they come in, it's going to be the grand opening. The gates are locked, and the branding is gone. Hey, is this your factory? Why are you here? Not kidding. This really happened. Fellows, right? Big American brand. Or another one I like to talk about is Segway. Because Segway is kind of iconic. It never really did well commercially, right? But it's kind of iconic. You see them around here and there, okay? There's an American company, a Chinese company that basically used the patents of Segway. I'm not sure how they actually obtained all of the technology, but some of it was just publicly available in patents. They built their competing product, which was basically exactly Segway. They went, and Segway went to the ITC and said, hey, look, this is unreasonable. These people are just infringing on all our patents. And in the process, they lost a ton of money. It was extremely expensive. And that Chinese company bought Segway in the process. Okay. And now Segway is owned by China. This is how it works.
So what should business owners understand if they want to do business in China or if they want to employ Chinese nationals here?
If you are going to do it, okay, understand, first of all, if the safest way to do it would be to have something that absolutely has no national security implications, either for us or for China. Okay. I don't know what that is even. I don't know how many things like that there are, but they probably exist. We could think about it. So that would be a lot lower risk, right? But the moment something becomes very popular again, the point is the number one thing you have to understand is that you have no legal protections whatsoever. And, if you invest a whole bunch of money into China, well, good luck getting it out. You might get some of it out, but they can just say no, right? So there's all these American companies right now that have invested billions in China. On paper, it's worth a lot, but I don't think they're ever getting that money, right? So I don't actually, I think it only exists on paper. So you just have to understand that's what you're getting into. Number two, if you have an interesting technology, okay, some sort of patents, you're required, you set up a partnership entity with a Chinese company. That's required for you to work there. Very few exceptions, okay? And you have to transfer your IP to them. That's it. That's part of the deal. That's how you get access to that. Admittedly, if you want to build like a small something, tchotchke, okay, I want to make a tchotchke. I want to make 10,000 tchotchkes in a month or something. China's a place where I can go and do that. They'll just, here's the tchotchke, build this for me, and I want 10,000 a week or whatever. And they can do that. They have this turnkey solution to this sort of thing. But if it's a very interesting, valuable tchotchke, okay, or whatever, then, once your production line is done, there's a whole bunch more of these things that are coming off the production line into the black market and are now being sold for 10%. These are the sort of, knockoffs, except they're not really knockoffs. They're the actual same product, just that, run on the line after the official run has already been done. So this is just the reality of operating there. I don't know if I answered both of your questions, but part of it.
You did. So one of the more interesting things I think that we have talked about when I was chatting with you was China's unproductive economy. So, we hear a lot about, China's having economic issues, and we think it's going to hit the same way that it hits in America. But something that you said I thought was really interesting, like, in the real estate space, they're building a bunch of apartment buildings and there's no one to live in them.
Ghost cities.
Yeah, ghost cities. But then they're just tearing them down.
Right.
So what's the purpose of this unproductive economy and how is it different and how can we understand it?
So, okay, there's a whole bunch. We could sit up here for hours to talk about this, but that's a great example actually of economy, right? So when you have an economy, we imagine when we're talking about GDP that it's productive growth, right? It's something that someone can use. You're selling a good to someone that actually uses it, because the production of the good itself contributes to GDP as well, right? So with these, there was this mass property, and here's a man that knows more about real estate than I will ever know, okay, by probably order of magnitude. But basically they, 70% of the wealth of mainstream Chinese people was actually in real estate, right? And so, because the idea was, you can imagine like this kind of massive property bubble way beyond anything in 2008. Okay, that would be one way to construct it. But when you're talking about GDP, right? China was always fixated on keeping that GDP high. When you build a city, now imagine you build a city that like 1 million people could live in, or 500,000, right? That contributes massively to GDP. Like you pour the concrete, the steel, the workers, all of it. It's a massive enterprise. But then when you demolish it, that also contributes to GDP, right? But what value have you created? None, right? You've created no value. And there's so much of this type of activity. And then, of course, you have state enterprises, and this is an important part of this, right? That are kind of all too big to fail. So even if their operations, they don't have strong incentives to be wildly productive, traditionally at least. Now they're being pushed a bit harder because they don't need to. They know, because I've got a high-level official at the top. Whatever I do, I'm untouchable. This is actually one way that way back in the day, they started capitalizing. This was a crazy idea by some, I'm not going to go into who did it, but basically they started capitalizing these basically non-performing Chinese state enterprises on U.S. markets because they realized these things, this will never go out of business. It doesn't matter that it's non-productive. It doesn't matter that it's not actually contributing that much, but it's too big to fail. So that's actually worth quite a bit on the U.S. stock exchange.
So why do they do that? Like what's the point of an unproductive economy? Is it just to say, hey, we have GDP growth to like the rest of the world, or to give people jobs, or what is it?
it's to create the economic miracle. Like the thing that communist regimes are the absolute best at is propaganda at all sorts of levels. It's still kind of astonishing to me. There's still people probably in this room, maybe among you, that believe that there's any semblance of rule of law in China. There is no semblance of rule of law in China. There just isn't. I don't know how else to tell you this. But there are laws that exist, but they're selectively enforced. They're used as political weapons, not as a tool of governance, if you will, or a direct tool of governance. So part of it, very much so, right? Now think about how much money Apple, there's an amazing book called Apple in China. I should be promoting my own book, but I'll just mention this book, okay? Apple in China. What he figured out, right, the author, is that Apple itself was investing at one point in the mid 2015, 2016, at past that time, so to the tune of tens of billions of dollars annually in China. It was basically training all these skilled workers. It was building all these factories for its products and so forth, right? It was more than the entire Marshall Plan, than the rebuilding of Europe and Japan put together, okay? Right? This was Apple. This is one admittedly massive company, right? But why did they do that? Because they were convinced of the hype. They were convinced that eventually they'll get this market that never seems to be coming, because this is the one leg that the Chinese economy is totally missing, which is the opposite of us, right? It has no consumer, well, not no consumer economy, but its consumer economy is insignificant relative to its overall economy. They don't spend in this way that like we do in America, where we're unusually focused on the consumer side here. Yeah.
So I know, going back to this, those ghost cities, right? People might not know if you just Google this. It's really interesting. I guess chat now, but there's massive highways going into the middle of nowhere with these. I mean, these are 40, 50, 60, 70-story buildings, office buildings, and there was never anybody there.
Well, they can't, because the property bubble, and still even today, right? The cost, even after the property prices have been going down, I think it's like 35 months in a row now, or something like that. And so, but still, the amount of money it takes for the typical person to buy something in one of these ghost cities is, I think the ratio that's just coming to mind, like in America, that the ratio is something like 17-1. I forget. The equivalent would be 47-1 in China. It's by far more expensive than Prague, than Paris, than any of these Tokyo, any of these cities.
Yeah, and so what you guys might know is that there's actually been a real estate decline for almost 3 years there, right?
Yeah.
So what does that mean? What that means is that people's wealth is going down, right? So what I've just been following, and what we should all follow is, honestly, it actually is a little bit tied to gold, because they're saying, okay, you can't invest outside of China, and certainly if your wealth is in real estate, where can we put it? And so there's one theory is that that's part of the reason that we're seeing some of the rise in gold.
Right.
Have you seen that much?
No, I mean 100%. They're buying huge amounts of gold. We're watching that. That's a good explanation.
The central bank is certainly doing that. But you think about it, like if you're going to invest and you're there, right, and your property market is going down, you're going to look for alternatives, right?
The only problem is, right, like I think if I was in China and kind of stuck there, I would be doing something like that, hedging into some of these sort of anti-inflationary products. But the thing is that, but they can just take it anyway.
Yeah.
That's the problem, right? So it's like, yeah, I've invested in gold, but when push comes to shove, do you really have it?
That's true. They can do that with real estate too.
Well, they do it
And
all
they
the time.
have, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So one thing that you talk about in China is there's a lack of innovation. And there's a lack of innovation, and that's why, they're stealing IPs and they're creating their own, duplicating items. What is it about America that creates innovation, and what is it about China that squashes it?
So how many of you are you familiar with with the difference between totalitarian rule and mere authoritarian rule? The difference. Anybody know so one of the biggest shams in a way, right? So South Korea was an authoritarian state. Taiwan was an authoritarian state. Japan was an authoritarian, well, possibly totalitarian state that shifted into an authoritarian state. And so the difference in a totalitarian state, there's something that back in the day, right? Remember Alexis de Tocqueville? He comes to America. He writes this amazing book, Democracy in America. And he sees Americans just see some issue that needs to be fixed. This is what either entrepreneurial or like in their faith communities or whatever, they just see it and they get together and fix it. They just get together and do it. This is just like a characteristic. He actually prophesied. He was an incredibly prescient guy, right? He said, this is what's going to make America awesome. And it did, right? And this is the feature. This is something that's kind of in the American zeitgeist. America's a rare a country that was created based on an idea, right? And the idea is actually that anybody can come here and make it from zero to hero or whatever you want to call it. But literally, this is the American dream. This is the story of Epoch Times, actually. This is our story, right? Came out of nothing. You know, we built one of the biggest media in America. And I also want to say a huge thank you to both of you for having me here. This is an unbelievable conference. And I think it's incredibly relevant to investors specifically because, you know, there's a whole lot of places to invest that you can go if you want to take some risk, right? In emerging markets and so forth. I would not recommend that place for all the reasons we just described today.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jan. And please, you guys, if you have questions for Jan or you want a copy of his book, please meet him over on the back table.
All right. Thanks, bud.
Thanks so much.